pleasure to be here tonight with Ohev's own Nathan Weissler and Professor Samuel Levine, who has, I prepared, I copy pasted his so that I can just put his bio in the chat. I do not like introducing people. Oops, why isn't it working? One second. I'll just link to, you can link to, I'm putting the link to his bio in the chat. As you can see, it is exceedingly impressive. But he is a professor of law and also Jewish topics at Touro, and has authored a book on Was Yosef on the Spectrum, as you likely saw on our flyer. And Nathan really brought the idea. We want to thank Nathan for bringing the idea of tonight's event to our attention and suggesting that we have something like this. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to take a new look at the character of Yosef as we approach the Parshiyot in which he exists. And so that I thought, it's a treat to be able to hear this, and especially right now at this timing when we'll begin the Parshas about Yosef soon, and we can all just have this in mind for a new way of reading this year. And so what we're going to do is just sort of want to provide the general introduction to that. Nathan and Professor Levine, would you prefer that folks interject with questions or save questions to the end?
Either way works for me. I defer to Nathan's preference.
Excellent.
My apologies, but can you please repeat the question? I didn't catch it. I'm sorry.
Nathan, I wanted to know if you can share with the group if you would like people. What's the best way for people to ask questions? Would you like them to unmute themselves? Are you able to see the chat while you're speaking?
Let's save questions for the end if that's okay.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
And then I'll be take questions as Professor Levine will be.
Okay, great, terrific. Okay, so what we will do now is Professor Levine is going to speak about the book for a little while, and then Nathan will speak after him, and then we can also, we can have it be as casual as we would like in a conversation between them and all of us. If you have any technical questions throughout, you can chat me directly or chat the group. So Professor Levine, if it's okay if we turn to you now for your comments.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Everyone can hear me. So I want to thank Ruth, I'm sorry. I think it's our first chance to meet face-to-face, or at least screen-to-screen. And the pleasure really is mine, and it's really an honor and a pleasure for me to speak with all of you tonight. It's an honor, among other reasons, because your shul is known as a shul that's in the forefront of recognizing a commitment to disability rights, inclusion, awareness. And sadly, that's not the case with many of our institutions, both within Jewish communities and elsewhere. So it's an honor for me to have this opportunity to meet with you and talk about my book in that context. It's also a particular honor for me to have a presentation alongside Nathan Weissler. As I'm sure you know, Nathan is a very important voice and emerging and really established as a very important voice in these areas of disability rights, awareness, inclusion, particularly in the context of autism. And Nathan has clearly established that voice within the Orthodox Jewish community and also, once again, beyond. So it's a real honor for me to have this opportunity to speak virtually alongside Nathan. It's also a real pleasure for me to speak to this particular audience. When I talk about my book, I sometimes speak to audiences that are interested in one or other of these broad topics, whether it's the story of Yosef in particular, or whether it's autism. It's not uncommon for my audiences to have familiarity with one area, but not so much with the other area, and perhaps not even so much of an interest in the other area. And it's my sense that this audience has, I'll presume, a familiarity, if not some extensive knowledge in the story of Yosef, as well as at least an interest and perhaps a commitment to, so it seems properly so, to disability rights and to autism in particular. I also want to thank Nathan, and it's a real pleasure for me to have the opportunity to speak with Nathan as well, alongside Nathan. In the course of the past, I'd say year or two, I've really had the chance to get to know Nathan, not as well as you all do, but we've had the chance to speak over the phone, had the chance to correspond by email, and Nathan was kind enough in a recent trip to New York to come all the way out to Long Island to the 5 Towns, and we had a chance to meet really face to face and have a terrific in-person visit with each other. So it's a pleasure, Nathan, to once again have this opportunity along with you. I want to thank Nathan for being the inspiration for this event. And in addition to thanking my route Ruth, I want to thank Yaakov Roth. I'm not sure if that's the Yaakov on the, I see on one of the names on the screen, but Yaakov, likewise, whom I know from the legal context, was also instrumental in organizing tonight's event. And I just want to also give a shout out to Erica Brown. I actually saw her name on your list. I think she's going to be speaking in a couple of weeks to you. And it was Erica who I know once again from other contexts who put me in touch initially with Nathan. Having the foresight that Nathan and I would have this common interest in autism and in the Torah and in the story of Yosef. And it really has been a pleasure over these years to get to know Nathan, and I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to speak with you alongside Nathan this evening as well. So given that we do want to have the chance, we all want to hear from Nathan. I want to hear from Nathan more than I want to hear myself, certainly. And given that we do want to have an opportunity to take your questions and to have a dialogue, and informal is great, about these topics, I want to speak just a few moments about my book, to provide the overall underlying thesis behind the book, and maybe a couple of examples that may illustrate my underlying thesis, which of course is that if we look carefully, if we read closely, the biblical story of Yosef, not only through the text itself, but also through the commentators and focusing on traditional classical Jewish sources, going back to Midrashim, going back to the Talmud, going through medieval commentators to contemporary, or at least modern and some contemporary commentators, I'd like to suggest that there's a common theme that develops. A portrait of Yosef emerges that's consistent with an individual who's on the autism spectrum. Now, a couple of caveats. First, clearly this is not intended as a diagnosis per se. I'm not a clinician. It would be difficult enough to diagnose someone face-to-face, meeting them in person, having sessions with them, speaking with them, observing them. We do have a very strong record, to the extent that we take seriously, which I certainly do, the biblical text, and not necessarily as literally depicting the events of Yosef's life, but the Midrashim teaching us lessons about insights that commentators have had throughout the millennia, spanning different parts of the world, and their impressions of this very fascinating figure of Yosef. So this isn't so much a diagnosis as an observation that the portrait that seems to emerge from a variety of different sources, again, spanning thousands of years and spanning different geographical areas all over the world, is consistent in many ways with the portrait of an individual on the autism spectrum. Another caveat, you may or may not have heard the phrase that if you've met one individual with autism, you've met one individual with autism. And I think that phrase captures the reality that no two people are alike. There are common characteristics that many individuals on the spectrum share in common with each other. And each individual is their own person, has their own unique characteristics, their own special qualities that may be similar, but may be very different from others as well, like anyone else. What we do seem to observe, and what I'd like to suggest, based on the research that's been conducted in recent times and going back at least decades, is that there are certain common characteristics among individuals on this fairly broad autism spectrum. And in that way, I just like to read, I don't want to read much from the book, but I do want to read just a couple of lines to describe for you some of the characteristics that I have found in Yosef, which again, I consider to be consistent with those of an individual on the autism spectrum. We don't have time, certainly, I mean, the book is 141 pages. I certainly don't have the time to describe all of the examples, all of the incidents in this rather expansive story that spans several parshiot in the Torah, where I would like to suggest there are indications that Yosef, again, is consistent. His characteristics, his qualities, his interactions with others are characteristics, are consistent with those of an individual on the autism spectrum. But I'd like to list some of these qualities, and I'll leave it to you as we continue to read these parshiot. They're coming up, as Ruth mentioned, to see if you think you can find examples that fit these qualities. So, for example, Yosef has social challenges punctuated by an inability to read social cues, understand and anticipate the feelings and reactions of others, and navigate social settings. He has an attachment to animals or to inanimate objects in place of interpersonal relationships. He has a heightened intellectual capacity and creativity in narrow areas of interest. He engages in repetitive and inflexible behaviors. He has what we might describe as a somewhat obsessive and compulsive focus on a private way of perceiving the world. He has a rigid and literal perspective on truth, ethics, and morality that sees virtue in extreme terms rather than allowing for nuance. So just a few examples in the time that we have where I've seen, and I suggest that we find some of these characteristics. So starting with the very first, the opening psukim of the Parsha, we're told that Yosef is a Na'ar. He's 17 years old and he's a Na'ar. So Rashi immediately points out that's unusual for the Torah to use the term Na'ar, which suggests a young child, a lad, as it were, for a 17-year-old who certainly in biblical times and to this day is more of an adult than a young lad. Rashi, of course, cites a midrash suggesting that Yosef was prone to playing with his hair in a way. He tended to his eyes, which Rashi suggests indicates that Yosef was concerned about his looks, which Rashi suggests, based on certain midrashim, childlike, seems to be the type of perhaps vain behavior that we might expect more of a child than an adult. There are questions we may raise. Why is vanity of that sense more childlike than adult-like? I think we all know many adults who are vain and concerned about their looks, perhaps more than a young child would be. And interestingly, looking at the original midrash, the midrash not only cites those two examples of behaviors of kind of playing, tending to one's hair, curling one's hair, tending to one's eyes. There's a third example that Rashi doesn't cite, a behavior that involves kind of kicking one's heels or lifting one's heels. The midrash also, at least one version of the midrash, does not cite Rashi's explanation that these behaviors were indications of a sense of beautifying oneself or being concerned with one's appearances. So I like to suggest that perhaps what the midrash is actually getting at is a common characteristic among individuals on the spectrum, children on the spectrum in particular, to engage in what we sometimes call self-stimulatory behaviors or activities, where individuals on the spectrum sometimes behave in these repetitive actions of perhaps curling their hair to suit themselves, playing with one's eyes. And the kicking the heels perhaps indicates toe walking. The literal term in the midrash is lifting one's heels, mitaleba akevo, that someone is hanging upon his heels, which suggests perhaps a toe walking, perhaps some sort of kicking motion, perhaps the nervous sort of leg twitch that is not uncommon among children on the spectrum as a form of self-stimulatory activity. And I'd like to suggest that what the pasuk would then perhaps be getting at is that Yosef to his brothers was a Na'ar. And the pasuk in particular says, Nar et Echav, toward his brothers, he seems immature. He seems childlike. Although he's 17 years old, he's engaging in the types of physical behaviors that other children may resent. that other children may make fun of, that may lead, unfortunately, to this day, other children to exclude and marginalize and isolate an individual because these children, their peers, don't appreciate and may resent the type of behaviors they're observing. Interestingly, the very same pasuk refers to Yosef bringing Bibatam Ra'av. He's bringing his brothers' statements, their negative statements, to their father Yaakov. And a question that arises is, what was Yosef telling his father about? And there's a famous midrash here as well that Rashi cites, that Yosef was telling his father that his brothers were engaged in some rather unsavory activities. Super commentaries on Rashi raise the question, do we really think that the brothers were engaged in these really pretty horrible activities? And there's a suggestion by the Maharal, the famous Maharal of Prague, suggests in his commentary on Rashi that the brothers were actually not quite involved. They weren't really engaging in the strict violation of these laws. They were engaging in, and it's a fascinating description of their conduct, on the one hand, finding sort of the loopholes in the law, engaging, for example, in eating animals that have been shechted at a point where under Bnei Noach laws, there would be one rule, and under Jewish law, the law for Jewish individuals, there would be another rule. So their conduct appeared to be improper, but perhaps technically was okay. That suggests to me that maybe Yosef didn't see the nuance, because it begs the question, if they weren't really doing something wrong, why was Yosef reporting on them? But perhaps Yosef didn't see the nuance, and again, consistent with a common characteristic of individuals who are on the spectrum, where he didn't see the nuance. He saw life, he saw morality, he saw justice and the right thing to do in what we sometimes call black and white terms. He didn't really see this gray area where they were finding the technicality, finding the loophole. He was uncomfortable with what he saw. And then of all things, he brings that information to his father. Now, from Yosef, from our perspective, that does not seem wise on Yosef's part. And of course, it's the first or one of a number of areas where Yosef essentially gets himself in trouble to his own detriment in a way that he's unaware of what he's doing. He's doing the right thing from his perspective, understandably so. He's telling his father that his brothers are doing something wrong. He's going to the teacher, and again, bringing the concept into contemporary terms, he's going to the teacher, he's telling on the kids who are doing the wrong thing, and he feels this compulsion, so it seems, to bring this information to the attention of the teacher. We look at the story and wonder, why is he doing that? And we are perhaps puzzled, perhaps even troubled. He's only harming himself. Well, again, a common characteristic of individuals on the spectrum is not to understand the repercussions, not to anticipate the way his words, the way his actions will impact others, not to see things from their perspective, but to see it from his own perspective, to engage in conduct, which again, from his perspective, seems to be the absolutely right thing to do. And interestingly, according to many of the commentators and according to these midrashim, Yosef is not talking about something that his brothers are doing to him. He's not going to his father because his brothers, at this point at least, are teasing him, are harming him. He's telling his father about something, telling the authority, about something his brothers are doing that more or less doesn't affect him, but it does affect him. And it's not uncommon for individuals on the spectrum to have this sense of right and wrong, to have this sense of justice, and to feel this compulsion to bring that wrongfulness to the attention of someone, to try to set it right, with the noble intention, with the noble motivation, but yet again to his own self-detriment. And this pattern continues, of course, with Yosef's famous dreams, where Yosef has these dreams, and we read the story, and it just hurts us to see Yosef telling the dreams to his brothers, and we know what they're going to say. We know how they're going to react, not just because we've read the story so many times, but it seems pretty clear based on this preface, based on the buildup, that they're going to resent his stories. They're going to resent his dreams. And not only does he tell them the first time about his first dream, but after they tell him off, after they make it, from our perspective, as far as we can see, as clear as can be, that they don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear about his ambitions, his dreams, his way of seeing the world. He goes ahead, has another dream, and feels compelled to tell them again. And the language that the pasuk uses, many of the commentators point out, he says to them, Shimunah, he's begging them to hear, he's pushing them, he's insisting that they listen to the words he has to say. And again, this, not surprisingly, we can see from the outside, we see where this is going to go, and we do see, of course, where it ends up. Now, the topic of tonight's, or the title, I guess, of tonight's discussion relates to neurodiversity and inclusion, which, of course, is such an important principle. And I'd like to suggest that we may be able to learn a story or a lesson regarding neurodiversity and inclusion from two more events in Yosef's life. So again, these are just a few examples. There are many, many others throughout the book where I find Yosef's conduct, Yosef's actions, the way Yosef expresses himself. And this goes through even when he is so successful. And of course, the rest of the story, or the story continues, where Yosef emerges in Egypt as a viceroy. He saves the entire world, with his brilliance, with his great ideas, even in that context. And we don't have time, to go into the details or to look at the text this evening. But if you take a look as we go through those parshiot as well, I'd like to suggest, and this is really based very much in comments by the classical commentators, classical Meforshim throughout the generations, even in his success, Yosef often uses the wrong words. Yosef often says the wrong thing. Yosef often expresses himself, even in his brilliance, in a way that's not quite appreciated by others. Now, there are a couple of figures in the story who pose a fascinating contrast here. And I'd like to, again, suggest that we can maybe draw some lessons regarding inclusion from these contrasting cases. The first is Yaakov, Yosef's father. Yaakov loves Yosef. Why does Yaakov love Yosef so much? There may be lots of reasons. The Torah tells us that Yosef was a ben zikunim to Yaakov. So what does ben zikunim mean? A child of his old age? Perhaps. There are commentators who suggest that Yosef, because he was born when Yaakov was older, Yaakov had a special love for him. There are other commentators who find that explanation a bit unsatisfying. A, because Yaakov had many of his children, including Binyamin, at least in old age or an older age than he had Yosef. And some of the other children, all the children were born, from what we can tell, in a fairly short period of time. But certainly it doesn't seem as if Yosef was specifically, and he was per se not the youngest child of Yaakov. He wasn't child born when Yaakov was at his oldest stage of fatherhood. There are others who suggest that ben zikunim is based on the context of, or the root of the word of zaken, of wisdom. The notion that to Yaakov, Yosef seemed to be a ben zikunim, a wise child, wise zaken in the sense of wise beyond his years. He's only 17, but he has the wisdom of a much older individual. Now, there are some commentators who point out, isn't there a contradiction here? A moment ago, we suggested that Yosef was a na'ar. He was childish. And now we're suggesting that he was so wise. He was wise beyond his years, like an older individual. I'd like to suggest that this actually points to what seems to be a contradiction, but is very much the reality for many individuals on the spectrum, where their behaviors may seem childish, their behaviors may not seem to fit their level of expected maturity at whatever age it may be. And that's why Yosef is described as a na'ar with his brothers, as opposed to a ben zikunim, where he's specifically described as ben zikunim to Yaakov, because it's not uncommon for adults to be able to appreciate the wisdom, at times the brilliance, the potential that individuals on the spectrum sometimes have. So rather than being a contradiction, I'd like to suggest that these two aspects reflect the reality that we often do find in the life and the experiences of individuals on the spectrum. What does Yaakov do? Yaakov wants to include Yosef. He observes the tension between Yosef and his brothers, and he figures, I have to somehow prop him up. I have to do something to promote what we all want, of course, the success, the inclusion of his beloved child. What does he do? He gives him a beautiful coat. Well, not surprisingly, that brings out the anger, the jealousy of his brothers. He also does something else, fascinatingly. When Yosef's brothers go off to tend the sheep, he says to Yosef, why don't you go see how they're doing? Now, what's Yaakov thinking? What Yaakov seems to be thinking is Yosef, and there are other indications based on the wording of the pasuk, roeh et achav betzon, Yosef was really good with animals. And again, it's not uncommon for individuals on the spectrum to have a connection with animals. It's an extreme example, but Temple Grandin, who may be the most famous individual on the spectrum, her field is not autism or disability rights. Her field is agriculture, is, I should say, animal science. She's invented ways of dealing with animals, and she speaks often about her special connection she has, the way she's attuned to animals, and in some ways, and she'll say this, more than she's attuned with interpersonal relations with others. Well, Yosef was an expert at this animal science. Let's just pause it. He was a really good shepherd. So Yaakov's thinking, okay, I'm going to promote inclusion by having you go see how your brothers are doing, and Meforshim say that he's going to check on them, and if they're having trouble, he'll set them straight. He'll help them engage in shepherding in the right way. Well, this sounds to me like the mistake that's all too often made by teachers, by parents who, again, have the best of intentions. They want to include a child in the spectrum, but, and again, I recognize there are stereotypes here, but it's not uncommon, I think scientifically as well, it's been proven through research, it's been found not uncommon for individuals on the spectrum to be pretty good at math, at sciences. So you may have a well-intended teacher who says, okay, we've got this individual who's really good, this kid, this child who's really good at math, and then we've got another kid who's kind of the popular kid who's not so good at math. Again, not to stereotype, some kids who are good at math are popular. So I'm going to send them out in the hall together. And you, kids on the spectrum, and you may be having other social challenges with your friends, here's your chance to shine. You go show that person, the popular kid, how to do it. Now, we all know that as well-intended as that may be, we can kind of predict where that's going. And of course, that's what happens when Yosef does eventually persevere to follow his father's instructions. He's dedicated to doing the right thing. But of course, that begins the course of events where his brothers sell him to Egypt. What happens in Egypt? Now, I'll close with this to contrast, of all things, the well-intended Yaakov to Paro. And I'm going to posit that Paro was not necessarily well-intended. Paro, as a king of Egypt, this isn't the Paro, presumably, but it's a Paro that we have no reason to believe was particularly magnanimous. We have no reason, I think, to believe that he was looking out for Yosef. I think he was looking out for himself. But when Paro realized that this is the person who has the key to his future, who has the key to the empire's success, Paro, and here too, we don't have time to look at the psukim, but if you look at the initial meeting between Yosef and Paro, and when you look actually stepping back to the Sar HaMashkim, who, as you recall, introduces and recommends Yosef to Paro, he's pretty reluctant as well. And there's the famous statement where he refers to Yosef as a na'ar, as an eved, as an ivri. And all the commentators ask, is that the best you can do? You're recommending someone to Paro? Is that, and my thesis is, again, if you look in the psukim, that the Sar HaMashkim, based on his own interactions with Yosef, he was not so sure. He was concerned that Yosef might say the wrong thing. He was confident that Yosef knew how to interpret dreams, but he was concerned that Yosef had said the wrong thing so many times before that he might once again say the wrong thing. And recall, based on Midrash, and we can expect that the royal protocol demands. If you do something wrong, you're in trouble. The Saramashim, whatever the mistake or the sin he did, whether it was a pebble or a fly in the wine, the last thing he needs is to introduce and recommend and promote Yosef, and then Yosef says something wrong and he gets blamed for it. Well, it doesn't faze Paro. Yosef does indeed, many of the commentators look at the dialogue very closely. Yosef does seem to say the wrong thing or say things in the wrong way to Paro. Paro's response is, you know what? You're my man. You're going to do it, and I'm going to make sure that you are successful. And here too, if we look at the psukim, what does Paro do? For the purposes of promoting inclusion, for the purposes of making sure that Yosef is okay and has the opportunity to shine in his areas of skill, what Paro does is tries to mitigate what he immediately senses are some of Yosef's areas of weakness in the social context. He gives Yosef new clothes. He gives Yosef a new name, a new persona. He gives Yosef a wife, presumably, or it seems from royalty, to protect him, as many of the commentators suggest. The supports are in place, the structure is in place. And this, I think, is the lesson of inclusion that one of the many lessons that I think we might learn from the story, that to promote the success, the inclusion, to help the lives of individuals on the spectrum, and this applies to many other disabilities as well, we as a society have the obligation to provide the structures, to provide the supports, and to allow individuals to demonstrate their talents, to allow individuals to develop their potential in a way that fits each individual.
Wow, thank you so much. Nathan, would you prefer to speak now and then we'll take questions at the end? Wait, hang on, I need to unmute you. Nathan, are you able to unmute? Oh, there we go. Okay, Nathan, you're there. So
Hi.
Nathan, would you like to speak now and then have questions for both of you?
Yes, that would be great.
Okay, excellent. Great. So Nathan, whenever you're ready, we'd love to hear your comments.
Okay. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. Professor Levine, it's really great to present with you, and thank you very much for your words about me. I really, really appreciate it. I'm speaking today about my own perspective on Professor Levine's book, Was Yosef on the Spectrum? Understanding Joseph Through Torah, Midrash, and Classical Jewish Sources. First of all, I'll start out by addressing why the book is particularly personal to me. I'm on the autism spectrum myself, and I've lived with for essentially my whole life a lot of what you, Professor Levine, were describing. So as I was reading your book, I really felt like I really understood what you were talking about. I really knew I really understood what you were talking about. In my opinion, one of the most beneficial aspects of the book is that while Professor Levine is honest about Yosef's shortcomings, such as making poor decisions regarding his interactions, including those with his brothers, and as you mentioned, Paro, Professor Levine is equally clear about Yosef's strengths, and that's really a big part of what I would like to emphasize today. The book really implies that the fact that Yosef was able to accomplish everything that he did, such as rescuing the Egyptian people from famine, was not despite the fact that he could well have been on the autistic spectrum, but if he indeed was on the autistic spectrum, then his incredible success is largely because of the way that Hashem made him. Indeed, I have certain character traits which I have heard is quite possibly linked to the autism spectrum, such as a photographic memory that frequently enhances numerous strengths. if I talk to someone on a certain date, I can often remember the date and the day of the week later. So chances are that 10 years later, I'll be able to tell you exactly what day we did this presentation and what day of the week it was. So on December 2nd, 2030, we can touch base. Sometimes when my parents have been are working on insurance claims, sometimes they'll ask me on what date I had an appointment with a certain doctor. It's because of that photographic memory that I'm able to answer, that I know the answer, that I still remember the answer. I've also found that it's particularly important to focus on the strengths of individuals who have special needs. We live in a society which, I'm going to be honest, often tends to emphasize the weaknesses, the perceived challenges, the perceived weaknesses, the perceived deficits of individuals who have special needs, When, in fact, I would even say that when people hear the word special needs in their head, that they often think, okay, that person must have weaknesses. And yes, we all have weaknesses. We all have drawbacks. We all have challenges. But, but we also all have incredible strengths. In my own life, if I have a challenging moment or a challenging day, it has happened that people have drawn sweeping conclusions about me and what I can do and what I'm able to do or not able to do. I often emphasize that people who have special needs really need to have the freedom to have challenges. Yes, to have a bad day, to have a bad moment, without it reflecting on them as people or on their capabilities or character. Indeed, that's largely why I'm so happy that the book highlights Yosef's strengths. While as discussed earlier, Professor Levine honestly does discuss Yosef's flaws. The conclusion that Yosef had many strengths, which ultimately proved invaluable, is unambiguous. And that's, I would say, one of the most important aspects of the book. And I would say another reason I'm glad, one reason I'm glad you're honest about his flaws is because now people can't dismiss this and say, oh, you're just an apologist for people on the spectrum. I like how you're saying yes, Yosef had flaws, but you're presenting it in the larger context of everybody having flaws, because you don't paint his brothers as perfect people either. You honestly discuss Yosef's brother's flaws, and you honestly discuss flaws on Yaakov's part. And I would say almost every character, you honestly discuss their flaws as you're honest about them as people. It is my hope that, among other things, that Professor Levine's book helps readers to have a deeper appreciation for the strengths that individuals on the autism spectrum and all people who have special needs have to offer. And that, as I said, in my mind, is truly one of the most important lessons that this book teaches. Another particularly important message of this book is that Yosef seems comfortable with who he is. That is also a particularly important lesson. And if appreciating one's strengths is lesson number one, I would say that being comfortable with oneself is really lesson number two. I often emphasize the need to be comfortable with one's limitations, and Yosef is comfortable with his limitations and modest to the point of, perhaps as Professor Levine argues, being too comfortable about being open about his limitations in certain contexts. When speaking with Paro right after his release from prison in Egypt, which Professor Levine you referenced earlier, Yosef attempted to credit Hashem for his abilities and gifts instead of giving credit to himself. So basically he was saying, wait a minute, why are you giving me a compliment? Compliment Hashem, 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 the God of the Hebrews. You might have heard of that people. Just saying, you might have heard of that people before. And you yourself say, Professor Levine, that it wasn't really a good thing to do because it might have reminded Paro that he was an Israelite. And it might have been good at that point to try to downplay that, or at least maybe that could have come up at some point, but not then. Maybe it could have come up at some point down the road. In fact, I would say it probably could have, but not then. One other thing I was just thinking about Paro. One other thing that I was just thinking about Paro is that we often don't look at Paro in the context of inclusion, but one could argue actually that Paro was very inclusive because, I'm sure many ancient royalty who would have just said, get out of here, Yosef, I don't have time for you, hit the road. but have a nice day. But Paro was willing to work with Yosef. He was willing to accept Yosef as an imperfect person, and he focused on Yosef's strengths. He focused on Yosef's strengths, and he found a way to include him, indeed, to the benefit of many people. And I really think that's an important message we can take from this. And that's something that people in positions of authority, a lesson I would say that people in positions of authority can and should take from Paro's behavior. In my own life, I'm going to talk now about an example of a way in which I'm going to now discuss a limitation that I have. In my own life, I do not drive and have decided that driving would cause me anxiety to such an extent that it would not be safe to be driving. I'm very comfortable with that decision and know that Hashem has given all of us different areas of strength. Nobody was meant to be good at everything. That was a value that Yosef, in my opinion, fully appreciated. And even though he did not always make the right decisions about how to express that value, his comfort with his limitations is really something that we all not only can, but should learn from. While I cannot speak for others, the fact that I'm quite comfortable with my limitations is, in my opinion, very much to my being on the autism spectrum. The above two messages, appreciating the strengths that individuals on the autism spectrum and more broadly, individuals who have special needs have, point one, and being comfortable with one's limitations, point two, are in my view among the most important lessons to learn from Professor Levine's book, Was Yosef on the Spectrum? Now, for the record, let me state that there are definitely other important lessons to learn from this book, but I don't think you all want to be here at 1 or 2 in the morning. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today about a unique and vitally important aspect of Yosef's story. Thank you, and if it's all right, I'm happy. If it's all right, I'm happy now to take. I'm happy now to take some questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nathan. And thank you again, Professor Levine. I really appreciate the point that you both of you touched on, that the story, it elevates the topic and brings it into the public discourse, and invites us to do that and to address it. And I think that that's a really beautiful and important point, and one that I'm grateful we all have the opportunity to do here together and with you tonight. So for the remaining 10 minutes or so, I invite questions, and if you can either type the question or just unmute yourselves and ask that way. So, and I just ask that you try to just state your question, slowly and clearly, and then we can have both Professor Levine and Nathan answer. So either in the chat or you can just unmute yourselves.
Yes, Helene.
Yeah.
I remember when I taught music in the Newton Public Schools, and we had autistic students were mainstreamed, and we were taught to play to the strengths of everyone. And I remember I was very grateful. There was a student, I had a lot of, and I remember teaching piano to one of the students who was on the spectrum that wanted to learn, and they asked me if I would do it. So I remember, once a week we would do it, and, working with this other girl singing solos, and, they were talented, and they were people. We all have, like you said, Nathan, we all have our strengths and weaknesses. And I'm very grateful that I worked in a school system like that encouraged us, that everybody was mainstreamed, and it worked out. And I learned more from them than they did from me. It was just a matter of course, and I'm very grateful that I was, I was helped. People would help me with it, and so and I miss seeing you at synagogue and you going in my car when I give you wrong. We remember that, Nathan. Anyway, so I'm right there with you with my weaknesses and strengths.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Helene, I just want to say I really appreciated what you shared about your experiences as a teacher. I want you to know that I really feel it was a meaningful part of the conversation.
Thank you, Nathan. I was lucky to work with the people I did.
Okay, so if anyone else has questions, you can put them in the chat or unmute yourselves.
Oh, I need
Yeah, go
to
ahead,
look
Nathan.
at. I'm just looking at the chat. I didn't know if I'd missed any questions in the chat.
No, just wonderful words of praise for you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you to everybody.
Of course. Professor Levine, can I ask you if you've had any negative reception to the book, and I'm just be curious what the product, like, you know, obviously, if there are any of that, the reception, how it's been received.
So largely very well, I'm happy to say. And in particular, the most meaningful response that I've gotten are from individuals like Nathan, not alone, who themselves identify, are diagnosed, self-diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum, families of individuals on the spectrum, friends, people who care for them, people who work with individuals on the spectrum. And, you know, I'd say the response I've gotten has been overwhelmingly, you know, very positive from many individuals in those different, you know, categories, we might say. I'm interested, I haven't gotten that much response to the thesis itself, sort of from maybe a scholarly perspective, or maybe people don't want to spend the time to go through, to work through, you know, the book itself and the sources. There's lots of footnotes, so just caution you, because I thought it was important, if I'm going to suggest this idea, that I do document and demonstrate how I document my suggestions. And, you know, as a legal scholar, and I see it as Yaakov Roth, so I see now that he mentioned in the chat before, and as Yaakov and many of you may know, that, you know, I write law review articles as a law professor, so we have footnotes that usually take up most of the page in our law review articles. So the same is not quite true of the book, but I do try to document. And I suppose that it would take a lot of work to really engage the different sources and decide for yourself whether you find the thesis convincing. The one reaction that I regret, in some ways might say resent, is not so much related to me and my book. It's the reaction where people suggest that I'm being critical of Yosef. And, you know, to Nathan's point, and which I think, you know, you will understand, I find it, you know, upsetting if people think that somehow we're being critical of someone by suggesting that they have a disability, that they're on the autism spectrum. And, you know, if anything, if we look at the story, and whether it's in the text itself or, you know, frankly, some of the midrashim, which again are not necessarily intended as literally telling us what actually happened, but the lessons that the midrashim sometimes portray, or some of the meforshim as well, some of the classical meforshim, seem to be actually highly critical of Yosef, and they suggest that some of his behavior, some of his actions really are somewhat inexplicable and problematic. And if anything, if we can, and the subtitle of the book is Understanding Joseph, if we can understand Yosef better, and as Nathan said, like anyone else, like all of us, understand both his strengths and his weaknesses as a human being, I much prefer that way of reading the Torah and reading the story of Yosef than actually criticizing Yosef as being, for example, vain, or as, you know, otherwise criticizing his conduct.
Thank you. I think that Rena has a question in the chat also.
Okay.
And Nathan, did you have a comment?
Well, not much. You basically covered everything I had said, but I just want to say that I completely, I just want to say that quickly that as you were saying that, I was thinking that my own life experiences actually give me a completely different perspective than those who would say that you're criticizing Yosef. Because as I've said before, the way I see it, your message is essentially one of your message of him is essentially positive. Your message about Yosef is essentially positive. At the same time, being positive. At the same time, you're also. At the same time, I guess what I'm trying to say is that what I wish more people would realize is that honesty in the context of a positive message doesn't equal criticism. And as I said earlier, I actually feel your honesty is good because there could be people on another end who could say, oh, you're just apologizing for Yosef's behavior. And I think you're striking a balance of being honest and also not appearing to be an apologist for things that were problematic, but also praise it, because yes, some of Yosef's behavior really was problematic. You're not being an apologist for that, but at the same time, you're also making clear that this is not a trash Yosef book. That the point of this book is not to criticize Yosef. You're being honest about some problematic actions of a highly successful individual, and your picture is really a very positive portrait of him. And the rabbi has a question.
Yes, thank you, Nathan. First of all, thank you, Nathan, so much for your beautiful words tonight. I'm really, really inspired by them as always. And Professor Levine, I really enjoyed your lecture a lot. You know, when I was thinking in your studies and in your research, are there any rabbis in Jewish history who really strike you as having some of these similar characteristics? I mean, we value extraordinary talents, and you know, sometimes the genius is associated with people who are on the spectrum also. Is there anybody who comes to mind? But that's just putting that out there.
Right. So, you know, I'm reluctant enough to even offer this perspective on Yosef, though we have quite a record, you know, in my view, reading the text, reading the Meforshim. I don't know of, you know, any rabbis I know enough about, certainly to sort of have this suggestion. But to your point, there's a world famous speaker, I suppose. Some of you may have heard of Stephen Shore. I don't know if that name rings a bell.
I know who he is.
You know, Nathan. So he's a professor actually at Adelphi University, not far from where I live. He is one of the most prominent international speakers on autism. And, you know, you can Google his name and look at his, you know, lectures and his story. He happens to be very closely associated with Chabad. His story regarding Chabad is that he travels all over the world and speaks, and like many of us, has nowhere else to go but Chabad to find a place to eat or a place for Shabbos and such. And he has made the observation that spending time and I guess observing students in yeshivas, he sees what he describes as many of the characteristics of an individual on the spectrum, being so focused on a very narrow, very specific detail, and to the exclusion of, you know, many other concerns, to the exclusion in some ways of other types of maybe interpersonal or experiences even. And he's drawn that comparison, and maybe to your point regarding maybe some of our great leaders over the years may have shared those characteristics.
Thank you.
Yes.
Go ahead, Nathan. Nathan, maybe you Sabrina has a question.
Yes,
for you in
that's
the
what I
chat.
was about to address.
Okay, great. I think like let's close with your response to.
I'm sorry, what did you say, Maharat Ruth?
Oh, sorry. I said, and then we can close after your response to Rena. So go
Okay.
ahead.
I'm ready.
Okay, great. Take it away.
Oh, I didn't. Oh. I'm sorry. I thought I thought that the question was going. I thought that the question was going to be asked on Zoom, but now I see it's in writing. My apologies. I didn't. Okay. I'm thinking about it. I would say yes. I would say yes, it does make me, I would say that even though my experiences and Yosef's experiences obviously were different, and my experience would be different from that of anyone else on the spectrum, I would say that because as you said, or as you indicated earlier, Professor Levine, everyone on the spectrum has unique experiences. I will say this, that Yosef's success, despite the fact that he lived in a world where the odds would have been against his success as an individual on the autism spectrum, I would say really makes me feel connected to him, because he had to show a lot of perseverance. And although our world today is a lot more friendly towards people on the autism spectrum, and with a variety of special needs, Yosef's perseverance is something that I deeply respect, and his perseverance is something that I attempt to emulate in my own life. So yes, in short, the answer is yes.
Thank you, Nathan.
You're welcome. You're very
Wonderful.
welcome.
Well, thank you again, Professor Levine and Nathan, both for sharing and for your creative thought. And I know for really giving us all so much to think about, as I said, as we enter the Yosef season. And so the recording should be available in the next couple of days, and then we can send it around. And Nathan, I know that everyone here knows how to find you. And I'm happy also to share Professor Levine's contact information with anyone who would like that as well. So thank you both again so much for sharing your Torah, your unique Torah with us, and yeah, and have a wonderful evening, everybody.
Thank
you.
It's been a real pleasure.